Once upon a time, Syria was ruled by a malevolent dictator called Hafez al-Assad. He was president for 30 years and died in the year 2000. When he died, the one supposed to take power was his son Basil, but he had died a couple of years before. So his other son, Bashar al-Assad, took power. He was hungry for power, and this led him to some radical decisions, which ended up starting a civil war which isn't over yet. This war was started by the Arab Spring movement. Despite of other countries in Europe and America trying hard to stop al-Assad, we are still in a complicated conflict which affects the whole world. People in Syria are protesting against al-Assad and trying to change their regime into a democratic republic. But in response, al-Assad orders to kill people, including peaceful protesters. Since this conflict started, over 11 million people have been killed or forced to flee their country. Many countries try to give help to the refugees by giving shelter, but unfortunately, every day it gets harder to help all the ones in need. The Syrian government received military support from countries such as Russia and Iran, while rebels receive help from countries such as Qatar, Turkey, UK, and France. Attacks in Syria have escalated over the past few years. Every year it increases, and it have come up all the way up to chemical weapons.
The Arab Spring was a series of anti-government protests, uprisings, and armed rebellions that spread across the Middle East. Syria and Libya were drawn into a civil conflict. The real problem started when a group of students painted an anti-government graffiti. Later, there were widespread protests against the back then President Bashar al-Assad. Also, there were violent crackdowns made by the government forces, which included the National Security Force. More than 4 years after it began, the civil war has killed over 220,000 people. For example, Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt had uprised against their leaders. Tunisia has moved the furthest towards a peaceful transition to a constitutional democratic system.
Bashar al-Assad was son of Hafez al-Assad, Syria's former president. His first older brother died, so he had become the dictator. On November 2000, he released 600 political prisoners to manipulate the population. US has accused him for having chemical weapons since a long time ago, so he responded violently to protests. President Assad announces conciliatory measures, releasing dozens of political prisoners, dismissing government, lifting 48-year-old state of emergency to end the protests.
The countries that are backing up the Syrian government are Iran and Russia, and the countries that are against the Syrian government are France, Britain, Qatar, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and the US. The US has an interest on Syria because they are living a constant fight against terrorism, especially from terrorist organizations such as Al Qaeda and ISIS. They also think on the best interest on their economy and how much benefit they could achieve by getting their oil pieces from there. Russia is also very interested in Syria. Syria is crucial for Russia in more than one way. For example, it has a weapon market, which Russia is really interested in. Also, Russia has a naval station near Syria. And finally, they have a preference on a stable rule in Syria. Moscow opposes the regime under US assistance. They don't want to change from an stable autocratic leadership to an stable democratic government, like the one in Iraq, Egypt, and Libya.
The importance of Syria is not only because of the resources it has, but because of the countries they share borders with. The Middle East is the oil production giant, and it is a sensitive spot for foreign intervention.
Al-Qaeda means the vase. Al-Qaeda claims to be avenging wrongs committed by Christians and Jews against Muslims over the ages, to reshape the Muslim world, drive Americans and other non-Muslims from Saudi Arabia to other countries, the home of Islam's holiest sites. Sunni Muslims are the biggest ethnic group, making up 70% of the country's population. most popular sect of Islam in the world and is being supported and spread mostly by Saudi Arabian efforts. Biggest supporters of the rebel forces and in recent years have developed increasingly hostile feeling towards the Shia Muslim Assad government.
Kurds are a separate ethnic group making up somewhere between 7 and 10% of Syria's population. The Kurds stand out for being one of the few groups to fully recognize women's rights, for being secular, which means keeping religion separate from the state, and for not discriminating based on religion or ethnicity. They are also one of the only groups who have not committed any unnecessary acts of violence in the course of the war. Thus, the Kurds are seen as the only real allies of the NATO countries in the war. The group began in 2004 as Al Qaeda in Iraq before rebranding themselves as ISIS, when they separate from them in 2014 and become a separate military group, and they have proven to be more brutal and more effective at controlling territory. The Muslims are the second biggest ethnic group in Syria, making about 12%. The majority of these followers are Alawites, as is President Assad. Although the Alawites are a minority in the country, they have held control over almost all aspects of the government since 1971, when the father of Bashar al-Assad took power. Mainly supported and funded by Iran as a counterweight to Saudi Arabia, almost all Shias in Syria support the Assad regime.